Picture this. It's a cold night in medieval Europe, and an old woman sits outside her cottage. Her neighbors watch her through their windows with suspicious eyes. Just 3 days ago, their cow died suddenly. And last week, this same woman had complimented that cow, calling it a fine beast. That simple coincidence might just cost her everything, because we're talking about 15th century Europe here, and witch hysteria is at its absolute peak. Today, I'm going to tell you one of the darkest stories in European history. A story about how thousands of innocent people lost their lives because of fear, superstition, and pure ignorance. This is the real story of the witch hunts, and trust me, it's way more terrifying than any horror movie you've ever seen. So buckle up, because we're diving deep into a world where being different could get you killed, where your own neighbors could become your executioners, and where the line between justice and murder completely disappeared. Let's start with the big question. How did medieval Europe turn into this nightmare? Well, it wasn't just one thing. It was like the perfect storm of terrible circumstances all hitting at once. First off, we're talking about the late Middle Ages here, roughly from the 14th to the 17th centuries. This was not a good time to be alive in Europe. The Black Death had just wiped out about 1/3 of the population. We're talking 75 to 200 million people dead. Imagine that. Every third person you knew, gone. But the plague was just the beginning. Crop failures were happening left and right. People were literally starving to death. Wars were constantly breaking out between kingdoms. The weather was getting colder. What historians call the Little Ice Age was making life even more miserable. So here you have millions of people who are scared, hungry, and desperate. They're watching their world fall apart, and they need someone to blame. They need an explanation for why everything's going so wrong. Enter the Catholic Church. Now don't get me wrong, not every church official was evil, but the church had been fighting what they called heresy for centuries. They'd already established the Inquisition to deal with people who didn't follow Orthodox Christian beliefs. But here's where things get really dark. In 1484, Pope Innocent VIII issued a papal bull called Summis Desiderantes Effectibus. Basically, this document officially recognized the existence of witches and gave church officials the green light to hunt them down. Then came the book that changed everything, Malleus Maleficarum, or The Hammer of Witches. Written by 2 German Dominican friars, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger. This book was basically a how-to guide for identifying, prosecuting, and executing witches. This book spread across Europe like wildfire. It was reprinted dozens of times and became one of the best-selling books of its era. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of a viral conspiracy theory, except this one got people killed. Now, you might be thinking, come on, how could people actually believe in witches? Well, let me paint you a picture of medieval life, and you'll start to understand. Imagine you're living in a world where you don't understand basic science. You don't know about germs, so when disease strikes, it must be magic. You don't understand weather patterns, so when crops fail, someone must have cursed them. Your baby dies suddenly in the night. Well, that can't just be SIDS, that's gotta be witchcraft. The average medieval person lived in constant fear of forces they couldn't understand or control. And here's the kicker. The church, which was supposed to provide comfort, was actually feeding these fears. Priests were literally preaching from the pulpit that Satan was real, that he had agents on earth, and that these agents, witches, were actively working to destroy Christian society. They taught that witches could fly through the air, turn into animals, cause impotence in men, make cows go dry, and even control the weather. But it gets worse. The church taught that witches made pacts with the devil. They supposedly attended something called sabbats, basically demonic parties where they would worship Satan, engage in orgies, and plot against Christians. And get this, they were supposed to be able to shapeshift into animals, particularly black cats. Now here's what's really messed up about the psychology of witch hunts. Once you start looking for witches, you're gonna find them everywhere. Every unexplained death, every crop failure, every weird coincidence becomes evidence of witchcraft. And the profile of a typical witch? Well, that's where it gets really heartbreaking. Most accused witches were women. About 80% of all victims were female. They were often elderly, widowed, or just plain different. Maybe they were healers who knew about herbs. Maybe they were midwives who helped deliver babies. Maybe they were just cranky old ladies who argued with their neighbors. The thing is, in medieval society, women like this were vulnerable. They didn't have male protection, they often lived alone, and they were seen as somehow threatening to the social order. When things went wrong, they made perfect scapegoats. So how did someone actually get accused of being a witch? Well, it could happen to literally anyone, for literally any reason. Let me give you some real examples from historical records. In 1563, in a small German town, a woman named Agnes was accused of witchcraft because she was seen talking to a black cat. That's it. That's literally all it took. The cat was probably just a stray looking for food, but in the minds of her neighbors, she was clearly communicating with her demonic familiar. Or take the case of Margaret Barclay in Scotland in 1618. She got into an argument with a ship captain about some business deal. Later, that same ship was lost at sea during a storm. Margaret was accused of using witchcraft to sink the ship and kill everyone on board. The evidence? The argument they'd had weeks earlier. Here's another one that'll blow your mind. In many cases, women were accused of witchcraft simply for being too successful. If a woman's crops were doing better than her neighbors, or if she seemed to have more money than expected, people would start whispering that she must be getting supernatural help. But the most common trigger for accusations was medical. If you were a midwife and a baby died during childbirth, you might be accused of killing it with magic. If you were a healer and someone died after taking your herbs, clearly you were poisoning people. If you were just an old woman and someone got sick after arguing with you, well, you must have cursed them. The accusation process itself was terrifying. Often, it started with gossip. Someone would make an offhand comment like, "Ever since I argued with old Martha, my chickens have been laying fewer eggs." Word would spread, and before you knew it, half the town was convinced that Martha was a witch. Sometimes accusations came from children. Kids would claim they were being visited by witches in their dreams, or that they saw women flying through the air at night. And here's the thing, adults believed them. They didn't think, oh, kids have wild imaginations. They thought, children are pure and innocent, so they must be telling the truth. But here's where it gets really dark. Once you were accused, you were basically screwed. There was no such thing as innocent until proven guilty when it came to witchcraft. The very fact that you'd been accused was seen as evidence that you might be guilty. And the methods used to determine guilt? Well, let's just say they weren't exactly scientific. Once someone was accused of witchcraft, the investigation that followed was absolutely nightmarish. And I use the word investigation very loosely here, because what actually happened was more like legalized torture designed to extract confessions. First, the accused would be arrested and thrown into jail. These weren't modern prisons we're talking about. These were dark, filthy dungeons where people were often chained to walls and left to rot. Many people died in these conditions before they ever made it to trial. Then came the examination. Investigators would strip the accused naked and search their body for what they called devil's marks or witch marks. These could be anything: a mole, a birthmark, a scar, even a patch of unusual hair. If they found anything that looked suspicious, it was considered proof of a pact with Satan. But it gets worse. They would also look for supernumerary nipples. Basically any small bump or protrusion on the body that they claimed was used to feed demonic familiars. Today we know these are just normal anatomical variations, but back then, they were a death sentence. Then there were the tests. Oh man, these tests were absolutely insane. The most famous was the water test, also known as swimming the witch. They would tie the accused person's right thumb to their left toe and left thumb to their right toe, then throw them into deep water. Here's the twisted logic. If you sank and drowned, congratulations, you were innocent. But if you floated, that meant water was rejecting you because you were in league with the devil, so you were guilty and would be executed. Either way, you were dead. There was also the needle test. Investigators would stick long needles into suspected witch marks to see if they felt pain or bled. If the area was numb or didn't bleed much, it was considered proof of witchcraft. Of course, they didn't understand that some areas of the body are naturally less sensitive, or that fear and trauma can affect pain response. But the worst part was the torture designed to extract confessions. And I need to warn you, this next part is pretty brutal. The rack was commonly used. This device would slowly stretch the victim's body until their joints dislocated. There was something called the strappado, where the victim's hands were tied behind their back and they were lifted off the ground by a rope, often with weights attached to their feet. Then there was sleep deprivation. Accused witches would be kept awake for days on end, with guards poking them with sharp sticks every time they started to nod off. After several days without sleep, people would hallucinate and say anything just to make it stop. And here's the most twisted part. Once someone confessed under torture, they were required to repeat that confession publicly, without being tortured, for it to be legally valid. But if they recanted, if they took back their confession, they would be tortured again until they confessed again. The whole system was designed to produce guilty verdicts. There was literally no way to prove your innocence. Even refusing to confess was seen as evidence of guilt, because obviously the devil was giving you supernatural strength to resist. The actual trials were less about determining guilt or innocence, and more about putting on a show for the public. These weren't fair legal proceedings. They were basically medieval theater designed to reinforce social control through fear. The trial would typically take place in the town square or the local church, with as many people as possible watching. The accused would be brought in, often barely able to stand after days or weeks of torture and imprisonment. The evidence presented was absolutely ridiculous by any reasonable standard. Witnesses would testify that they saw the accused flying through the air, or that their crops failed after arguing with them, or that they had strange dreams after encountering them. Hearsay was not only allowed, it was encouraged. Someone could testify that they heard from someone else that someone else saw the accused doing something suspicious. Third-hand rumors were treated as solid evidence. But here's where it gets really messed up. Other accused witches were often forced to testify against each other. Under torture, people would name anyone they could think of, hoping to stop their own suffering. This created a snowball effect where one accusation led to dozens more. The accused were rarely allowed to have legal representation, and even if they were, most lawyers were too scared to defend someone accused of witchcraft. After all, defending a witch might make you look like a witch sympathizer, and that could get you accused too. The prosecution, meanwhile, had all the resources of the church and the state behind them. They had professional witch hunters, guys who made a living traveling from town to town, identifying and prosecuting suspected witches. These men were paid for each conviction, so they had a financial incentive to find people guilty. One of the most famous of these witch hunters was Matthew Hopkins, known as the Witchfinder General in England. Between 1644 and 1647, this one man was responsible for the deaths of over 300 people. He developed systematic methods for extracting confessions and became incredibly wealthy in the process. The trial itself was often just a formality. By the time someone made it to trial, their guilt was already assumed. The real purpose was to make them confess publicly, to name other witches, and to serve as a warning to anyone else who might be tempted by the devil. Verdicts were almost always guilty. In some regions, the conviction rate was literally 100%. And once you were found guilty of witchcraft, there was only one punishment: death. The executions were designed to be public spectacles that would terrorize the population into compliance. These weren't quick, merciful deaths. They were prolonged, agonizing ordeals that could last for hours. In most of Europe, the preferred method was burning at the stake. The victim would be tied to a wooden post, surrounded by bundles of wood and straw. But here's something most people don't know. The fire was often built specifically to maximize suffering. A merciful execution would have the fire built high enough and hot enough to cause smoke inhalation, which would kill the victim relatively quickly. But in many cases, the fire was built low and slow, so the victim would burn alive from the feet up, staying conscious as long as possible. In some regions, they would hang small bags of gunpowder around the victim's neck. This sounds merciful, like it would cause a quick death. But actually, it was just designed to create a more dramatic show when the fire reached the powder. In England and some other regions, accused witches were typically hanged rather than burned. But don't think this was more humane. Medieval hanging wasn't the quick neck snap you see in movies. The victim would slowly strangle to death, which could take 10 to 20 minutes of conscious suffering. The worst part? Family members were often forced to watch, and in some cases, they were required to pay for the wood used to burn their loved one, or for the rope used to hang them. Imagine being forced to pay for your own mother's execution. But the horror didn't end with death. The bodies of executed witches were often left hanging for days or weeks as a warning to others. Sometimes they were burned after hanging. In some regions, the ashes were scattered so the victim couldn't have a proper burial. And here's something that'll really mess with your head. Sometimes, people who were obviously innocent were executed anyway, because officials were afraid that releasing them would make people question the whole system. It was better to kill an innocent person than to admit that maybe, just maybe, they'd made a mistake. The psychological impact on communities was devastating. Neighbors turned against neighbors. Families were torn apart. Children were encouraged to report their own parents. The social fabric of entire regions was destroyed by suspicion and fear. So, just how many people died during the European witch hunts? Well, the numbers are staggering, and honestly, we'll probably never know the full extent of the horror. Conservative estimates suggest that at least 40,000 to 50,000 people were executed for witchcraft in Europe between 1450 and 1750. But many historians think the real number was much higher, possibly as many as 100,000 people. To put that in perspective, that's more people than were killed in the 9/11 attacks, every single year, for 3 centuries. And remember, most of these were completely innocent people whose only crime was being different, or unlucky, or just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Some regions were hit harder than others. Germany was particularly brutal. Some German states had conviction rates approaching 100%, and entire villages were sometimes wiped out. In the small German town of Würzburg, over 900 people were executed in just 7 years. Scotland was another hotspot. Between 1563 and 1736, an estimated 4,000 people were executed for witchcraft in Scotland alone. That's about 1 execution for every 300 people in the country. But here's what's really heartbreaking. About 80% of the victims were women. Elderly women, young women, mothers, grandmothers, daughters. The witch hunts were, in many ways, a systematic war against women who didn't fit into prescribed social roles. So how did this nightmare finally end? Well, it wasn't because people suddenly became more enlightened or compassionate. It ended for much more practical reasons. First, the witch hunts were getting expensive. All those trials, all those executions, all those professional witch hunters, it was costing governments a fortune. And the economic disruption of killing off so many productive members of society was starting to hurt. Second, the hunts were starting to target the wrong people. When accusations started reaching wealthy merchants, government officials, and even nobility, suddenly people in power started questioning whether maybe this whole witch hunt thing had gone too far. Third, new ideas about evidence and legal procedure were starting to emerge. The scientific revolution was beginning, and some people were starting to ask for actual proof, rather than just accepting supernatural explanations for everything. But probably most importantly, some brave individuals started speaking out against the madness. People like Friedrich Spee, a German Jesuit priest who had served as a confessor to condemned witches. He wrote anonymously about the innocent people he'd watched die, and his writings helped turn public opinion. By the early 1700s, most European countries had stopped executing people for witchcraft. The last legal execution for witchcraft in Europe was in Switzerland in 1782. A servant woman named Anna Göldi, who was killed basically because she'd had an affair with her employer. So what can we learn from this dark chapter in human history? Well, unfortunately, the lessons are more relevant today than we might like to admit. The witch hunts show us how quickly fear and hysteria can destroy a society. They show us what happens when we stop requiring evidence for serious accusations. They show us how dangerous it is when people in authority encourage scapegoating of vulnerable groups. They also show us how easily good people can become complicit in evil. Most of the people who participated in witch hunts weren't monsters. They were ordinary folks who got caught up in mass hysteria and convinced themselves they were doing the right thing. The witch hunts remind us that civilization is fragile, that the difference between a functioning society and a nightmare can be surprisingly small, that fear, ignorance, and prejudice are always lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the right conditions to explode into violence. But maybe most importantly, They remind us to be skeptical of moral panics, to ask for evidence, to protect the vulnerable, to remember that extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof, and to never, ever let fear override our humanity. The next time you hear someone being demonized for being different, or see a group being blamed for complex problems, remember the witch hunts. Remember what happens when fear wins. Remember that the price of civilization is eternal vigilance, not against witches or demons, but against the darkness that lives inside all of us. Because the real lesson of the witch hunts isn't that medieval people were uniquely evil or stupid. The real lesson is that under the right conditions, any of us could become either the accusers or the accused. And that's a thought that should keep us all awake at night. Thanks for watching, and remember, the most dangerous magic has always been the power to convince good people to do evil things. Stay skeptical, stay human, and I'll see you in the next video.